Tyrannosaurus rex didn't hunt Triceratops. Tyrannosaurus rex avoided Triceratops whenever it could, and when it couldn't, the bones tell us the fight didn't always end the way you'd expect. For over 100 years, we've gotten this one wrong. We pictured Triceratops as the peaceful one, the plant eater, the rhino with extra horns. We put it on lunchboxes and stuffed it into the friendly dinosaur slot in every kid's book ever printed. Meanwhile, the actual fossil record was telling a completely different story, and most people never heard it. This is the dinosaur the king of the Cretaceous was afraid of. In a moment, I'm going to walk you through one specific fossil pulled out of the Montana Badlands in 1997. A Triceratops horn scarred with T-Rex tooth marks, marks that had healed. Right now, you need to understand why a Triceratops walking around with a bite scar from a T-Rex is one of the most disturbing fossils ever found in North America. Let's start with what Triceratops actually was. Not the cartoon, the animal. It was about 30 feet long, nose to tail, roughly the length of a school bus parked at the curb. It stood about 10 feet tall at the shoulder, which is taller than the ceiling in your living room. It weighed somewhere between 12,000 and 24,000 pounds, depending on the individual. Call it 6 to 12 tons. A fully grown male African elephant weighs about 6 tons. A large adult Triceratops could weigh twice that. So we are not talking about a cow with horns. We're talking about something heavier than 2 African elephants with a head the size of a small car. That head is where this story gets interesting. The skull of an adult Triceratops was about 8 feet long, 8 feet, longer than the average king-size mattress. The frill at the back, the part that looks like a giant fan, wasn't ornamental. In Triceratops specifically, that frill was solid bone. No openings, no weak spots. It was a wall of skull fused into one continuous piece, designed to take a hit. Some specimens have frills that show scarring, healed punctures, gouges from other animals trying and failing to get through. The 2 big horns above the eyes, the brow horns, grew up to about 3 to 4 feet long. Most documentaries leave out the next detail. Those measurements are just the bone. In life, those horns were sheathed in keratin, the same material your fingernails are made of, the same material that builds a rhino's horn. That keratin sheath added more length and a sharper point than the bone alone. The functional weapon, the part that actually punctured flesh, could push toward 5 feet in length, on each side of the head. There's something else about those horns that paleontologists figured out only recently. As Triceratops grew up, the horns changed direction. Young Triceratops had horns that curved backward, away from threats. As the animal matured, the horns straightened and rotated forward into the position of an active weapon. By adulthood, those points were aimed dead center at whatever the animal was facing. The geometry shifted from defensive to offensive over the course of an individual's life. That is not a passive ornament changing shape. That is a creature growing into its violence. So picture this: a 12-ton animal with 2 5-foot daggers mounted on the front of its skull. And it could pivot that skull, swing it, drive forward with all 12 tons of body weight behind those points. If that sounds familiar, it should. That is essentially how a medieval lance worked. Except a knight on a horse weighed maybe a ton, including the armor. Triceratops weighed 12 times that, with 2 lances, and no rider to knock off. That image matters, because the next part is about who it was used on. In 1997, a partial Triceratops skull was excavated from the Hell Creek rocks of eastern Montana. When paleontologist John Happ examined it years later, he found something that changed how people thought about these 2 animals fighting. The outer third of the Triceratops's left brow horn was missing, snapped off. and the broken end of what remained was covered in cone-shaped indentations that matched the tooth tips of a large tyrannosaur, almost certainly an adult T-Rex. The horn had healed. Around the missing tip, the bone had regrown. Around the bite marks, the surface had remodeled itself. The injuries showed signs of infection, then recovery, which means this Triceratops got bitten in the face by a T-Rex, lost a chunk of its horn, and walked away alive. It lived for years afterward. A T-Rex jaw is not a delicate instrument. It could deliver about 12,800 pounds of bite force, the strongest land animal bite ever measured. It could crush bone. It snapped the tip off that horn like a person breaking a piece of celery, and then the Triceratops kept living. That's just one fossil. There are more. The most famous is a specimen still being studied right now, sometimes called the dueling dinosaurs. Two skeletons found locked together in the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, recovered in 2006. A young T-Rex and a Triceratops, fossilized in apparent combat, with damage on both animals consistent with the other one inflicting it. We don't have all the answers yet. The full scientific paper hasn't fully landed. The fossils themselves tell a clear story. Whatever happened between those two animals at the end of the Cretaceous, neither of them walked away. What makes the dueling dinosaurs specimen so important is the preservation. Most fossil finds give you a single skeleton. You read the wounds, you read the position, and you guess at the cause of death. Here you have both participants. The T-Rex had teeth embedded in the Triceratops' body. The Triceratops had injuries that matched the T-Rex jaws. The two skeletons were buried fast, probably in a flood event, while they were still entangled or while one had just died from the encounter. That's not a fossil. That's a crime scene, and we have both bodies. The specimen sat in private hands for years, locked in legal disputes, before finally being acquired by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in 2020. The research is ongoing. When the full paper does land, it is likely to be one of the most cited papers in dinosaur paleontology of the last 50 years. Pull back a moment. Look at the broader pattern. When paleontologists examine the bones of Triceratops specimens recovered from Hell Creek, a surprising number show tooth marks from tyrannosaur jaws. Some are post-mortem feeding traces where T-Rex was scavenging or breaking down a carcass. A meaningful subset show signs of healing. Bone that was bitten then partially regrew, which is the same story as the 1997 skull. T-Rex bit them. The Triceratops survived. The wound closed up over months. They walked away with a scar and a new piece of information about how dangerous the world they lived in actually was. The fossil record is telling us, across multiple specimens, that this herbivore was not easy meat. It fought back, and it won often enough that the survivors made up a meaningful chunk of the population we keep digging out of the rocks. There's a part of this story nobody talks about. In the Hell Creek Formation, which is where most of our T-Rex skeletons come from, Triceratops is the single most common large dinosaur. More Triceratops fossils have been pulled out of those rocks than any other species over 4 feet long. They were everywhere. They dominated that ecosystem. If T-Rex had hunted them the way lions hunt zebras, that ratio would not exist. You don't get a population that abundant if it's being efficiently culled by the apex predator. The math doesn't work. The numbers tell us that whatever T-Rex was doing for food, it mostly wasn't full-grown Triceratops. So what was T-Rex eating? Probably juveniles, probably sick or wounded adults. Probably the carcasses of Triceratops that had already died from disease, age, or fights with other Triceratops. Because the latest research shows that Triceratops killed each other constantly. The horn injuries on Triceratops skulls match other Triceratops horns more often than they match T-Rex teeth. These animals fought their own kind for territory, for mates, for dominance. They were, by herbivore standards, exceptionally violent. T-Rex was probably hanging around the edges of those fights, waiting for one of the combatants to bleed out. Sit with that for a moment. You're an apex predator. You're 40 feet long. You have the bite force of a hydraulic press, and the most reliable food source in your entire ecosystem is the loser of a fight between two animals you're afraid to attack head-on. That tells you everything about Triceratops you need to know. We have to talk about the body because the body is part of the weapon system. Triceratops walked on 4 legs, not 2. The front legs were short, powerful, and angled slightly outward in a kind of crouched stance that was perfect for one specific thing: driving forward. The shoulder and neck muscles were massive, packed onto a frame designed to channel force into the front of the skull. The whole front end of the animal was built like the engine of a battering ram, with all that weight aimed forward through those 2 brow horns. Triceratops could probably charge at somewhere between 15 and 20 miles per hour over short distances. That doesn't sound like much. Compare it to a modern rhino, which can hit about 35 miles per hour, and Triceratops sounds slow. There's a difference. A rhino weighs about 5,000 pounds. Triceratops weighed up to 24,000. The kinetic energy of a charging Triceratops at full weight, even at its slower top speed, was more than half again what a rhino can produce. In raw forward momentum, the Triceratops carried close to 3 times the punch. If a Triceratops hit you at full speed, it wouldn't matter what you were. It wouldn't matter if you were a T-Rex. The horns would go through, the body weight would follow, and the fight would be over in about a second and a half. Hell Creek paleontologists have a nickname for Triceratops. They call it the tank. The nickname stuck because the math justifies it. The horns get all the attention, but there's a second weapon system at the front of this animal that doesn't get talked about: the beak. Triceratops had a sharp, keratin-covered beak at the very front of its face, used in life to clip vegetation. That beak was reinforced with bone, edged like a heavy garden shear, and powered by jaw muscles built to crack the woody stems of cycads and palms. Inside the mouth, behind the beak, were hundreds of teeth arranged in dense vertical columns called dental batteries. These columns sheared past each other like the blades of a paper cutter. The animal could process plant material that would have torn a modern cow's mouth apart. Now, apply that mouth to an injured T-Rex. The beak alone could probably take a finger off a human in a single bite. Applied to a vulnerable spot on a downed predator with the full body weight behind the head, the damage isn't theoretical. The teeth weren't designed to eat meat. They didn't have to be. They were designed to shear through fibrous material, and a T-Rex tail or a tendon is structurally fibrous material. This was an animal built to win fights at multiple ranges: the horns for long range, the beak for close range, and the frill for everything that came at the back of the skull. Now, I want to be careful here because what comes next is partly speculation and the science is still catching up. We don't know for certain whether adult Triceratops lived in herds. Most of the fossils are found individually, solitary skeletons scattered across the formation. That used to be taken as evidence they were loners, like modern rhinos. More recently, bone beds containing multiple juvenile Triceratops have been excavated, which suggests at least some social grouping among young animals. Whether adults stayed together is still being debated in the literature. That matters for the same reason a hornet's nest matters more than a single hornet. If even small groups of adult Triceratops did stick together, even occasionally, then an adult T-Rex approaching a Triceratops in the open would be facing not one set of horns, but 2, or 3, or 5. 5 animals, each one capable of independently spearing a predator from the front and flanking from the sides simultaneously. There is no scenario in which a single T-Rex wins that engagement. None. Even if Triceratops was usually solitary, a single full-grown adult was still, pound for pound, one of the most dangerous animals ever to walk on land. The horns, the frill, the body weight, the forward charging stance, the willingness demonstrated in the bone record, to actually use the weapons. Now imagine standing on the floor of a Cretaceous floodplain in what is now eastern Montana. The air is hot and humid. The plants around you are mostly ferns and conifers, with a few flowering plants closer to the rivers. The sky is the same color as it is now. The ground feels the same, and about 200 yards away, you see something move. It's a brown shape, low to the ground. 3 feet of brown shape, then 10 feet, then 30 feet of solid mass, lifting its head as it catches your scent. The head is the size of a small car. The horns catch the sun. The body weight is what your brain can't process. Not at this size, not on land. You start backing away. The Triceratops watches you. It does not run. It does not flee. It pivots slowly in your direction and lowers the head a few inches. The brow horns drop into position, forward, aligned with you. In that moment, the smartest thing you could do is hope a T-Rex shows up, because the T-Rex would also be backing away, and the math would change. The first Triceratops fossils came out of the ground in the spring of 1887 near Denver, Colorado. A local schoolteacher named George Lyman Cannon dug up a pair of giant horn cores and shipped them east to Othniel Charles Marsh at Yale. Marsh looked at the size and shape of the horns and decided he was holding the remains of a giant extinct bison. He gave it the formal name Bison alticornis, and the matter seemed settled. A year later, in 1888, a fossil hunter named John Bell Hatcher cracked open a hillside in Wyoming and pulled out a more complete skull, the frill, the beak, the third horn at the nose. Marsh saw the new specimen and realized his bison was nothing of the kind. In 1889, he renamed the animal Triceratops, 3-horned face, and the public got the version we still live with, the gentle plant-eater, the herbivore counterweight to the savage T-Rex, the dinosaur version of the noble cow. It was completely wrong. In the last 20 years, mostly through analysis of healed wounds, tooth marks, skull geometry, and the statistical pattern of fossil distribution in Hell Creek, the real picture has emerged. Triceratops was a heavily armored, frequently violent giant that fought T-Rex and won often enough to keep its population the highest of any large dinosaur in its ecosystem. It killed other Triceratops over territory. It used its horns the way modern animals use horns, for combat, not for display. And it lived in a world where it was, functionally, the dominant force in its ecosystem, even though we keep handing that title to T-Rex. T-Rex was the most powerful predator that ever lived on land. Triceratops was the animal it learned to leave alone. The Cretaceous ended 66 million years ago when an asteroid about the size of Manhattan slammed into what's now the Gulf of Mexico. Triceratops died with the dinosaurs. So did T-Rex. Both species are found in the very last rock layers of the Cretaceous. Both went extinct together on the worst day in the history of life on Earth. 66 million years later, we dug them both back up. We rebuilt their skeletons in museums. We put T-Rex on the posters, and we put Triceratops on the kids' pajamas. We made one the predator and the other the prey, because that's the story we wanted to tell. The fossils never agreed with us. If you ever get the chance to stand next to a real Triceratops skull in a museum, do it. Get close enough to look at the horns from the side. Notice the way they angle forward. Notice the size of the skull, the depth of the eye socket, the thickness of the frill. Then walk over to the T-Rex display and look at the gap between its open jaws and picture the geometry of a fight between those two animals at full speed. You'll figure out pretty quickly which one you'd bet on. The story we tell about dinosaurs is mostly a story about a few famous predators and their long shadows. T-Rex, Spinosaurus, Velociraptor. The killers got the marketing budget. The animals that fed them, that built the ecosystems they hunted in, became background characters, set dressing for somebody else's story. The real Cretaceous wasn't about the predators. The real Cretaceous was about an arms race that lasted tens of millions of years between increasingly massive prey animals and increasingly massive hunters, both sides escalating in size and weapons and intelligence until something had to give. T-Rex was the final answer to a problem the herbivores had been creating for ages. Triceratops was the herbivore that finally pushed back hard enough that the predator started to lose. Then, an asteroid ended the whole conversation. Mark this down. For about 2 million years before the extinction, the largest predator that ever walked the Earth shared its world with an animal it was probably afraid to attack. They walked the same floodplains, they drank from the same rivers, they saw each other across open ground, and they made different decisions about whether to engage. The herbivore won that calculation more often than not. That is the dinosaur we put on lunchboxes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.